Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for logging on tonight. My name is Brett, and I'm a reference librarian with New Britain Public Library, and I'm very excited about tonight's presentation. This is our second collaboration with Concura, and I'm glad we got to do it so soon. We'll start to introduce all the panelists for tonight, and we're going to start with the moderator and who's going to be leading the discussion, Ellen Gilson, both. And Ellen is an active conductor and published, regularly commissioned composer. She currently serves as artistic director of the Farmington Valley Chorale. Previously, she served as artistic director of Novi Cantori and conductor of the Pioneer Valley Symphony Chorus, as well as music faculty at Western CT State University, Westfield State University, Western New England University, Gordon College, and Ithaca College. Thank you so much, Ellen, and I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Brett. It is wonderful to be in this Zoom room with these incredible colleagues, and I'll introduce each of them, but thrilled for this partnership with Concura and New Britain Public Library. And I want to start tonight by introducing Dr. Galen Robinson, who is serving as a guest conductor for the Moses Hogan concert next month. And we're thrilled to have Dr. Robinson here tonight. He's Director of Choral Studies at Central Connecticut State University, and his students will be performing with Concura's singers next month. As a conductor, Dr. Robinson has had the honor of conducting choral performances in venues as the Knight Concert Hall in Miami, Florida, and the David Geffen Hall in New York's Lincoln Center. So welcome, Galen. Jermaine Woodard, baritone, is among the singers who are performing in Concura's concert. He is a vocalist and recording artist in a professional performing career in choral, opera, music theater, oratorio, contemporary, inspirational, jazz, liturgical, sacred music, and the list keeps going, as I know Jermaine. He is all over the face of Greater Hartford County as a singer and sings with Concura among many ensembles. So Jermaine, I'm thrilled that we can spend this night in this call. Chris Shepard is Concura's artistic director since 2015, and he also serves as music director of the Worcester Chorus in Worcester, Massachusetts, and the Masterwork Chorus of New Jersey. His choirs have collaborated with a number of orchestras, including Hartford Symphony, Juilliard Orchestra, and in Mexico as well. So, Chris, great that we can all be a part of this call. I'm going to start with a question, and I'm opening this up for all of the panelists. And I think about this when, as we experience and look back over years of study and performing, that there are certain pieces or certain moments that make an impact, that shape us. Because it's not only our job to shape music, but the music shapes us. And I'm wondering, of the three of you, Chris and Galen and Jermaine, what experiences have you had singing, performing, conducting spirituals that you look back as some of the most powerful or impacting for you? And I'm wondering what the spiritual was, what the event was, and how it impacted you. Any of you want to jump in first with that?
Galen, why don't you go first? You're our guest.
We'll take that one first, and sure. Singing and performing Moses Hogan spirituals have been one of the greatest gifts of my career. The biggest impact I think that I've had over the years was the year 2003, which is obviously really important right now, because that was the year that we lost Moses Hogan. And in the summer of 2003, at the Mississippi Boulevard Church, Leo Davis, who actually performed with Moses Hogan Chorale in the early years, he had invited a number of the Moses Hogan Chorale and singers at the time, and including Moses Hogan himself. It was going to be a tribute concert that summer of 2023. Unfortunately, in February of that year, we lost Moses Hogan, but the singers came anyway. and it was to say the least very emotional. The songs that were presented on that particular concert were just I can't describe it at this point. I never knew Moses Hogan personally. All I knew of was the stories and the associations by my own conductor, colleague, and mentor, Andre Thomas, who was a close friend of his. Dr. Leo Davis was also a close friend of Moses Hogan, but those stories that I heard impacted me so much. I'd always performed Moses Hogan spirituals. As a choral director, it was a rite of passage. If you were going to perform a spiritual, and you had the capacity, your choral ensemble was equipped to actually do them and do them well. It was something that you just had to, you felt you needed to do on your concert. And it wasn't a novel thing. It was a matter of musicianship, so to speak. So that was my memory of the music of Moses Hogan on that concert. Spirituals like Hold On, Certainly Lord, and Bridget Bazile singing the solo spiritual Walk Together Children.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Jermaine,
Chris and
do
Jermaine.
you want to go first, Jermaine?
You go ahead, Chris.
What was that?
No, you can go ahead.
Okay.
Am I coming across okay?
Yep, yep, that's great. And that's so awesome to hear, Galen, and particularly to know that close connection. And I should say to everybody that completely accidentally, serendipitously, as Galen said, Moses Hogan died so tragically young of a brain tumor in 2003. And it turns out the date that we chose for the concert is the 20th anniversary of the day that he died. So such a wonderful tribute. As it turns out, my own connection to the music of Moses Hogan was delayed because the years that he really emerged on the scene were the years that I was living in Sydney. And so I would hear about him and a couple of the pieces that were the most famous, but it was really only when I returned in 2008, and he'd been gone for 5 years, that I realized that he single-handedly changed the face of the American spiritual, and in a remarkable way, he sort of represented an entire generation. The story that I want to tell is almost completely different because it's an experience with the African American spiritual that crossed the Atlantic. And some of you may know the music of Sir Michael Tippett, particularly his great oratorio, A Child of Our Time. It's a very modern piece, and it is a story of Kristallnacht and the boy who was implicated in the killing of a German officer in Paris. And Tippett, who loved American spirituals, decided to use 5 of them, including Steal Away, Deep River, some of the most gorgeous, what are known as the sorrow songs in the tradition. He decided to use them much as Bach used chorales, as pillars to comment on the action. And when I was living in New York and conducting the Dessau choir, we were hired to sing in one of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine New Year's Eve concerts for peace. We performed that work. I just sang. I wasn't even conducting. But Leontine Price was in the audience because she was the mentor for the soprano soloist. And it was just, for me, this incredible experience. It's extraordinary music, but also the idea to be connected with a woman whose recordings of spirituals, including Margaret Bonds, whose music we did last year. And I just felt, it's very different as somebody who was not born into that tradition, that I think that white people access it in a different way, always a step or two removed. And there I just felt so connected to different ways that the spiritual has been so important to 20th century music.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
It was
Jermaine.
beautiful, Chris. If for me, the spiritual it's so ancestrally important, and it has this ancestral penetration to who I am and what I stand for. And the direct correlation that I have to the spiritual is just coming off of the hills of singing Mark Hayes's My Lord, What a Morning just yesterday, which is almost Moses Hogan adjacent. And knowing some of the personal battles that I often go through daily or just internally, knowing the impact and the divinity and the history surrounding the nature of the spiritual is something that is very impactful and resonates with me pretty often. Though I did educationally and academically come to it, I guess, delayed in a sense, or it was postponed because I grew up in a household full of gospel, jazz, smooth jazz, um, pop, R&B, soul, and my when academically I was afforded the education at my performing arts high school to learn about these choral giants that is now Margaret Barnes and Moses Hogan and Mark Hayes, Nathaniel Dett. It just opened up a breath of new opportunity to sing their works and actually try and put myself in the embodiment of what these works meant to them in a modern time. And again, having just testified to Mark's words in yesterday, knowing that I almost wasn't sure how it was going to come out, it's always a blessing to see it translate and through people's visceral reactions, their faces, their emotions, and I'm getting emotional just even thinking about it. But that's what the spiritual does for me. So it's not any one particular event, even though I recently did music down in my soul with another group of mine, to see any and everyone of all types sing this music and do it with gusto and a freshness, a naturalness to just let go and sing is something I marvel at all the time.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's because it's that meeting place. Like I can think of certain spirituals at key points or turning points. And it's because in that moment, for at least for me, you experience it and you feel like your experience meets the experience of so many people. And it draws together in a magnetic way, and you can identify kind of and insert yourself in that experience. I was thinking about that, what makes anything stand the test of time, what any kind of style of music, and it's our ability to insert ourselves and identify it and have it reflect back to us our life experience. And I think that's what we all can do with this treasure trove. So I approach this, as I think of it as a conductor and as a composer and arranger. And before even getting to that, I'd love to unpack more about the spiritual itself and how, when you think of the journey it's taken, whenever we translate music from one medium to another, whatever the style, it gives us this new lens on what the original is, but it also can present some challenges in staying true to that original. So we think about how the spiritual comes into the world, it's music for voice. And many of us now experience these spirituals as pieces that have been arranged for choirs. They're presented in notation. And how do we engage with that journey that the spirituals have been on? And we can say this of any style, but how do we step into identify with that journey and how it can give us a new lens on on the original, but also present challenges to us as we want to stay true to that original? I'll throw that out there for all of you. Please take it and run, whatever
Well,
order.
I would love to share something that I only learned as I've been researching for this concert. And it tips on its head part of what we think about spirituals. I mean, I think we all know, or at least have some sense, that this was music that was born in the pain of enslavement. And it was a way for people who had so little scope to express themselves. It gave them some sense of agency in expressing themselves. But the amazing thing for me about this repertoire is, as I've thought about that very question, Ellen, and as I said before, knowing that this music does not belong to my own, as you said, Jermaine, this is not ancestral music for me. There is not ancestral, if there is any ancestral penetration, it is a reckoning that I, as a white person, have to understand of that music that was born in such extraordinary pain. But here's something that I find extraordinary. The reason that this repertoire, to a large extent, has survived at all was because many of us will have heard of the Fisk Jubilee Singers, which was a Black choir of trained voices, by the way, which I also thought was quite interesting. And they went around the country concertizing with this repertoire, arranged so that really from the time this repertoire entered the world that was separate from the plantation, it was kind of already in this form. But here's the thing that I find insane, and you guys may know this, I didn't know this. The Fisk Jubilee Singers, they were all former slaves, which is already a pretty remarkable thing. And they were quite ambivalent after the group was formed. They were ambivalent about continuing to sing this music, because for them it was associated with being in chains. And I find that really interesting because there's a connection there that it is important to see, that this was music they wanted, many of them, to leave behind because of what it represented. And I find that a really interesting twist in the tale, a sting in the tail for this music.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Chris, I agree. It is, when you think about maybe all of the negative aspects of slavery, all of the horrors that were visited upon a race of people, it's no wonder that they probably wanted to get away from it. You know, it's this idea that we've been through that and we're looking for greener pastures. We're looking for something that's more positive in life. And those singing these songs were just a reminder over and over and over at that time, because the wounds were still so very fresh emotionally in their minds that they wanted to just rid themselves of that and look towards a brighter day. But you're right, it was something that they really didn't want to do. And so the Jubilee Singers were led by George White. So he was a white man who was the choral director of these slaves, and these songs that were being performed were to help the university, not just the choral department. It was really helping to finance the entire university. And that was always so interesting. As far as the journey, Ellen, is concerned, I'm always, every opportunity I get, and this might lead into a question later, as far as the journey is concerned, I'm always concerned that we don't give spirituals short shrift. In other words, the authenticity. It's so easy to just look at notes on a page, on a sheet of music, and not stay true to the interpretation of the text and the performance practices, which not enough people actually bother to research. It's not enough to just say, we're singing with great tone and intonation and phrasing. The text has to be internalize and lift it off of the page in order to make real and true music and staying true to the intent of the composer, just like any piece of music we pick up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thinking of that as a recipe, right? It just gives us these, a bit of framework, but ultimately it's, we're the ones, creating in the moment. Jermaine, what are your thoughts?
I think capitalizing off of what Galen said, I'm thinking now of the totality of these pieces that we're referencing, the text painting, the journey that the singer is going through, the singers as a collective, the spirituality that's in it, the pain and suffering, the referential material to biblical times, and it's something for me as a young singer. It's so imperative that I throw myself into the music that I'm singing, because I not only want to just sing it, like Galen said, with this tone and richness and clarity, but you really want to communicate the message. And when there's so much, dare I say, trauma surrounding some of the text behind the spirituals or the hymns or the slave songs, the chain gang songs that we sing in more modern times, there's a lot of energy behind that. And I think that collective energy that often some singers want to bring to the table to then create this homogeny of sound and harmony and just performance, rendering something authentic and something true. I just cannot help but think about the last time I sang music down in my soul. And when singers of white descent, Asian descent, Indian descent, when they just let go and sing and trust what's on the page, as a younger historian, I don't often have that wealth of knowledge to reference to. So hearing Galen, get straight to the core of some of these historical facts that I didn't even know, it just informs my singing even more. And it's something that I'm going to keep with me, especially as I move into territory of singing more spirituals, because young singers today, we go on a different track that almost is deviating. And I'm not just speaking from personal experience, but it's something that I've heard colleagues alike say, like, that spiritual, that gospel song sounded very different than how I knew it growing up. There seemed to be this void of soul and again, energy behind what they were singing. And I never want to be that singer that communicates anything less.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't be, Jermaine, don't worry.
I was thinking this.
Our audiences know Jermaine
I'm being moved.
as a great communicator.
Yeah, that's right. I'm thinking about how our work as composers and arrangers tells a lot of ourselves in one way or another. And I'm curious to get your thoughts from the three of you about what makes these arrangements unique and what do they tell us about Moses Hogan, the person? His journey, his personality. What can we take? I have certain adjectives I think of when I spend time with his music, even though I never had, and I regret I never had the chance to spend time with him personally. I can think of certain adjectives that come to mind when I listen to his music, and I have a sense of what that personality might have been like behind it. But I'm curious as to what you all think.
Can I play something?
Please.
So for everybody out there watching this, Galen and Ellen and we all decided that we'd sit at our pianos because so you can illustrate something. The thing for me, and if you don't mind, I'm going to just put this in a little bit of a historical context, which is I think that what had happened, and it is so weird that the years I was gone, 96 until 2008, those were really transformative years for the American spiritual, largely because of Moses Hogan. And I loved hearing Jermaine talk about his own, almost apologetically, which is, I don't think you need to be at all apologetic about this, Jermaine, that your experience in your family with that music, this is cut for me, the salient point about Moses Hogan is it's as if he said, okay, all of these old, the William Dawson arrangements, the Hall Johnson arrangements, these are great and they are great. But what had happened was it had become standard practice to do a concert full of shortish pieces. And at the end, you do either a closer or even an encore of an African-American spiritual. And these were all arrangements from the 1940s and 50s. They'd been around forever. Now, mind you, they had stood the test of time. And I know Ellen and Galen, we all do these high school, regional, and all state festivals, and you still do these pieces because they're awesome. But the world of Black music had changed so much that the spiritual given way to gospel, and then of course into all the popular forms. And so for me, I'm just going to play a little bit of a hymn. It's the like the Sesame Street. One of these things is not like the others. This is actually a setting of a Welsh hymn. It's not even originally an African-American spiritual, but it shows you straight away. It's as if Moses Hogan said, we need music that speaks to our generation and our time. And you can hear just in this little arrangement of Abide With Me, you hear the voice of jazz, you hear elements of blues, of gospel, and just sort of, he just ripped the tradition and pulled it straight away into the modern contemporary time. Gorgeous, right? You hear in that this, first of all, he was a phenomenal musician, went to Oberlin, went to Juilliard, but you hear in the voice of that this awesome jazz musician and saying it's okay to do this. And what was so great is that so many of these older arrangements, to say nothing about the white composers like Marshall Bartholomew and Fenno Heath at Yale, who had taken sort of became part of this tradition. It was so diatonic. It had very little chromaticism and had none of those bluesy, jazzy chords, which is crazy when you think of where the Black church had moved to by then. So that was what I hear in Moses Hogan.
I was just going to add to that, thinking about that arrangement in particular. There's a moment that gets me every time. Well, there are multiple moments, but I think about this all the time in my work in composing and arranging, is that you're constantly balancing what to deliver that people expect and what to deliver that they don't.
Yes.
And if you do too much,
he gets that balance all the time. He gets that balance right all the time.
Every time, particularly where you have that, that moment that you did, and then he goes to a different chord when he could go back to one, and he doesn't. He goes to that chord to take you to the minor six. So he's delivering on an expectation, but he's turning that expectation upside down. And that,
And you do have to say about the older school of spiritual arranging is that much of it was almost like comfort food. It was about doing the expected, but then bringing verve and energy and spirit to it. Galen, you've got a piano right there.
I sure do. And the Abide With Me, I was playing through it earlier. It is absolutely one of my favorite Hogan arrangements. It's not that it's so difficult, it's just how it's set, which is absolutely gorgeous. It's beautiful. In the African American church, you can't exist and have experienced music in the African American church without knowing that there is a distinct blues element and even some jazz that's interwoven through any of the spirituals, gospel, and in particular, the hymn. The African American musician will take a hymn and make it something totally unlike what we've ever imagined it was going to be, while maintaining the spirit and the melody itself, the integrity of the melody. And that is what Moses Hogan did so expertly. And those types of songs, unless we get a different reimagining of spirituals in another 50 years, I think that these will still be fresh in the minds of everyone. So one of my favorites is Deep River, which is the name of the solo collection of his pieces that, in my mind, rival what H.T. Burley did at the turn of the century. They're so popular that many artists will perform them to this day quite often. So listen to just a little bit of the Deep River, and you will hear just like an Abide With Me, except these were just, it's an actually composed accompaniment rather, and this is what Moses Hogan is always doing to us. Those resolutions that Ellen spoke of they're everywhere, but they're timely and they're tastefully done. And I can never get enough of Moses Hogan.
Galen, don't you think, because I do those with my soloists at my church all the time. I love them. And I know you and I will work well together because you chose my favorite. Don't you get the feeling when you play them that they all began as improvisations?
Absolutely.
Like they just feel so elemental. Like it's in that music, even more than in his choral music when I conduct it, that I feel connected to Moses Hogan, the musician. I mean, what a great musical voice that man had.
And you're so right about that. They begin as improvisations because in the African American church, a musician will play a piece, particularly an introduction to a piece, and will play it differently every single time. There's it's never repetitive, and but it's still very tasteful, maintaining the integrity of the melody.
Mm-hmm.
It's gorgeous.
Just like singing, and I am feeling inspired because this piece will not leave me, but I hope I do it justice. I hear music in the inspired me. I'm gonna mute myself now.
Oh, no, you're
Gorgeous.
welcome.
Chris, tell me that Jermaine is singing This Little Light of Mine.
Oh, it's whatever you want. You're in charge.
Okay, it's a done deal.
Good. The audition went well, Jermaine. Do you know what I was thinking? First of all, I was wishing that I had a Hammond organ at the house, but I don't. And secondly, I was thinking, the way that particularly in those solos, but also in the choral music, Moses Hogan leaves the melody. It was exactly what you just said, Galen, that when you improvise in the Black church, maybe between hymns or maybe if a preacher is preaching or something, the melody stays intact. Moses Hogan, he really does that, doesn't he? When I'm thinking a couple of times in those solo movements, those solo settings, maybe near the end, he'll do something unexpected, but the melody is quite unadorned except for the accompaniment. Do you think that's accurate?
Yes, I totally agree with that.
And is that a sort of fundamental, not rule, but sort of rubric of the best kind of spiritual settings? Is that purity of voice remains
Purity of voice, and it's staying true to what we have thought of in terms of the melody, the established norms of the spiritual. He tests the boundaries in terms of the accompaniment and all of the chord structures and rhythms. I mean, he totally changed rhythms, of course, as well. And that's what makes it so new and refreshing. So he found a way to reimagine the spiritual, but staying true to what we always thought it should at least still sound like at its very roots.
Yeah. And you know what, the piece that I think of with that, which I can't even demonstrate on piano because it's so complex and it's not piano driven. Any of you guys out there who are watching this, who have sung a lot of spirituals over the years, you might know the very famous arrangement of Ezekiel Saw the Wheel by William Dawson. And near the end, there's that awesome wheel in a wheel, in a wheel, in a wheel, and wheel in a wheel. There are all these different layers, and the layers together, when it all gets going, spins like this UFO kind of thing that we imagine was in the air. And what's interesting is in many arrangements, or at least let's say some arrangements, but particularly in Elijah Rock, which is one of the most famous of the Moses Hogan arrangements, he does something like that. That the bass is set up Elijah Rock, and then the tenors Elijah Rock, oh Elijah Rock, Elijah. All of these rhythms that create this layering. And the interesting thing is that, and it shows how he was so plugged in both to the tradition of the spiritual, but also he was, very well-trained classical musician, as I said, that two streams contributed to that over those decades. One was the arrangements like Ezekiel Saw the Wheel, but that's Philip Glass. That's minimalism. And so he takes something that was so fundamentally serious art music, brings that into the spiritual, but then, as Galen just said, he keeps the melody intact so that it is always sewn into the fabric of the tradition. I mean, these are just, I hope that everybody who's here today can come see this performance, because it's music. This is a retrospective concert. And the reason why I did it was because this is a composer who deserves, like any major composer, like Bach or like Handel or like Brahms, he deserves a concert of his own so that the audience can see a consistent, singular voice expressed through 20 different spirituals. I mean, it's such an honor to be able to do this, don't you think, Galen? I don't think that people very often get to do, also because it's hard. These are what we were looking through. Okay, what are the ones that the high school kids will be comfortable with? Like, this is a hard music.
It's hard music. It's serious music, and but it's from in terms of its substance, it's just so great. I feel fortunate being able to do them. I haven't done one in just a little while, and thank you, Chris, for inviting me back to do it.
Well, I may just give you the whole concert. We're at this point, we're splitting it, but now I really just want to see what Galen can do with this music.
As you're talking, I'm inspired by the whole program, right? Each one of these, it's this well, right? Each one of these arrangements. I'm thinking about what you were just saying about the streams of the rhythmic repetition. I'm thinking about I Can Tell the World in particular, because he has that there, but what he infuses melodically into the rhythmic ostinato, both for bass clef and treble clef. What he's doing in both is what's brilliant to me, is that the way he's merging that melodic sense with the driving rhythmic repetition. The other thing, as I was listening today, and I think a lot about dynamic shape on the micro level and the macro level, and you think of the composer, the rise of this in the Romantic era, and on a small scale and a larger scale. And when I look through and think about so many of his works, I think about how he achieves that. And I'll play just a section here of Hear My Prayer. He builds 3/4 of the way in, and he uses all of the tools. He's using duration, he's using texture, he's using the height, he's bringing all those tools converging, and then he does the same thing in slightly different dress with each of the subsequent lines. But then when you look at many of the other spirituals, like even with We Shall Walk, which he builds to that 2/3, 3/4 point and comes back from it. And he never leaves you hanging. He delivers on the assurance and the comfort and the grounding that you need as a listener. That's been my experience, immersing myself in listening.
And the interesting thing, so you go, Galen.
The thing about Hear My Prayer is that Moses Hogan wrote it himself. It's not a pre-existing piece, which I always found fascinating, just absolutely gorgeous. And he wrote it for the occasion of his friend Chester Hairston's upon his death. And I remember that piece really speaking to me, because when Moses Hogan died, I went straight to the Moses Hogan, his website, and there was a performance by Anthony Leach and his ensemble, Essence of Joy, on the website, singing that particular piece. He had been in the hospital for a little while before they actually announced his death. And it was so emotional. It's as if I'm listening to it and thinking that he wrote it for himself, knowing that this would be his song upon the occasion of his death.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, God, that's so powerful.
What's so powerful for me when I look at that, he's not telling us what to say, what to pray, what to think, what to preach. He's just partnering. He wants to have us walk with him in this journey of life, and what you can insert, whatever you insert into that, but there's space for all of that.
Agreed.
Now, after having said that, this is going to sound incredibly prosaic, but I do want to make an observation, because when you were talking about how he structures and it's all there. This is the core of, I don't want to be too dorky. Again, I know we're going to have to come to the end of the program, but the core of modernism is the idea that the composer's intent is complete on the page. And you might think of it as just add water music, that if you do everything that's on the page and you do it with all of the instructions that are given, then what will come out will be what the composer intended. And here's the beauty of Moses Hogan, that I agree, to go back to where we started, that there is very little music that is more heart-based than the African-American spiritual or Moses Hogan's iterations of those. But what I love as a conductor, and what we can teach the younger singers that Galen is bringing from Central, or the high school singers who are joining us for 4 pieces, or even I see Nancy Eaton here, or even our own singers, is let's start with the page. Let's start with the page. Do not ignore anything. Do not ignore that accent, even though it's a little weird that it's there. Do not ignore that fast diminuendo that would be very easy to fly by. And then you allow his voice to emerge. And then you throw in great singers like Jermaine, and you allow his heart to emerge. And that's the great marriage of performance practice with what is the art of the performer. And I think that's why his legacy is going to be really long lasting. And exactly what Galen, it sort of gave me goosebumps, because it may be 50 years. It may be 50 years, just as it was for great composers like Chester Hairston, that they were not superseded for 3 generations, because what they did had such integrity. And I feel the same way about Moses Hogan.
And that leads to one of our last questions in the time we have. So if you, this is for Chris and Galen, if you were coaching a young or emerging conductor about how to best explore the performance practice of the spiritual, and Jermaine, if you were coaching a singer, what would you say are the most important things for that?
Well, I talk too much, so I'm going to give it to you guys.
I was going to say, I'm going to jump in here only because I'm so inspired by what Chris said about Hogan's substantial educational training and this classical essence that he really started to adapt and adopt into its own music, and the homage that he pays to the operatic lexicon, using these big finale chords with such gusto and robustness, and allowing the singer to, when you see that sforzando or that marcato, you better use it. But then at the end, you better let it rip. And I take such pleasure. It's pretty obvious probably, but I take such pleasure and delight in being able to conclude a piece with that much energy, that much heart, that much soul, because oftentimes some singers don't want to sing so teeny weeny and off the voice. And Hogan, he just transcends genre after genre after genre. And Galen's beautiful interpretation of what he just played, like, I am personally greatly affected by the second in a chord, and knowing that Hogan plays tribute to that in so many of his pieces, just intoxicatingly gorgeous to me. So as someone who was trained operatically, but really a choral nerd at the end of the day, I revere Hogan for how he uses such nuance and specificity in his arrangements. And to a young singer, I think Chris kind of said it. For me, don't ignore what's on the page. There is a marriage to be had here, where you show up and the music has shown up. So meet it harmoniously at the meeting place and just give it what you got. And if there's training involved, great. But for some people, and in the gospel world, there was no training. It was, you saw mom and dad and aunt and sister and brother in the Pentecostal choir stomping and shouting, and just it was that passed down. I can't find the word right now. I'm losing my vocabulary, but it was that that pass down of sound and harmony and repetition and scripture that really penetrated to my ancestors. And we kept that going. And to see, I'm so grateful that I have not deviated from this music, even though my education would have probably tried to throw me down a different path. I just felt the trajectory was so solid when, as I see spirituals really affect me, and just yesterday. So that's what I'm going to conclude with. Let your heart speak.
Great. Much like William Dawson, Moses Hogan is very specific in terms of what he wants. When you look at an old William Dawson score, all of the accent marks, he leaves little to chance. And Moses Hogan, much like that, it's very specific in terms of what he wants. I would implore young conductors to study, to look at choral scores of or Nathaniel Dett, Burley, John Work, all of those composers, and even modern composers that don't get the attention that William Dawson, but Moses Hogan gets, but making sure that you study those particular composers and adhere to the performance practices. Now, I think one of the best resources right now out there is the Andre Thomas, who wrote the foreword to this Feel the Spirit compilation of Moses Hogan spirituals. Andre Thomas's book, Way Down Over Beulah Land is what it's called, where he talks about performance practices and diction, tempo. All of that is addressed particularly in the different types of spirituals that we hear. So I would say certainly research and make sure that you're staying true to the intent of the spiritual.
We have just a few minutes left. So one last question, and this has to do with the program as you're putting it together. We shaped concerts to be a journey for singers and for audiences. So I'm curious, as you're putting this program together, this is for Chris and for Galen, what are some of the things you're thinking about for that process, for the journey for singers and audience?
This is something we were talking about amongst us before this Zoom, that from the beginning, there's essentially two traditions within the spiritual tradition, two kinds of songs: the sorrow songs and the jubilee songs. So songs of praise, which are still, by the way, rooted in that enchainment. And so the thing is, there are going to be many pieces in a concert of spirituals that end, as Jermaine said, they have that big operatic ending. And so one of the tricks is to make sure that it doesn't feel like a program full of encores in that sense. And boy, nobody builds to a climax like Moses Hogan does in some of these. I had asked, because he knows the repertoire so well, particularly in working with Andre Thomas, I'd asked Galen to choose. There's a book. It's wonderful. There are 2 volumes of this, and it's great to have that legacy. So I asked Galen to choose them, and boy, he chose so well, just to make sure that and now finding the shape within it will be the next challenge. Galen?
And you're right. That will be the challenge. There are just golden nuggets of just wonderful pieces. So deciding in any set list of songs that you do, well, what works best as an opener? What works best as a closer? Well, that's the challenge, of course, because a number of them do, but finding those moments of at least diversity in terms of tempo, in terms of tone, that will be the challenge for us, and I'm happy. It's a good problem to have.
And I return to that idea of what I said before, that a retrospective, and by the way, I don't think we do enough of this in choral, orchestral concerts do this a lot. I don't think that choral concerts do enough of retrospectives. I think that we are a little bit we were all weaned on a little bit of everything style of a choral concert. And particularly, look, if you are at a college or high school, I was a high school teacher for many years, you need to expose them to many different things. So that's very natural. But just like when you go to a retrospective art show, you are first struck by the similarity, but then when you get deep into it, you are struck by how a voice changes, an artistic voice changes over decades. And what a tragedy that with Moses Hogan, we didn't have 2, 3, 4, 5 more decades. He was what, 45, I think, when he died, just ridiculously young.
Yeah, he was very young. And you're right. I often thought, wow, what else was he was turning the page. He was about to start doing even more tenor bass pieces. He only did one SSAA number out of the entire repertoire at that point, and who knows what was to come.
And oratorio that could have emerged. I mean, they're just, even though this legacy is rich, you do have to bemoan the fact that we lost so much more.
I agree.
Well, there's so much more we could go into, and I'm looking at my clock right now. We're an hour into this conversation, but if you're joining this and you haven't already put this date and time on your calendar, now is the moment to do it. And I'll turn things back over to the New Britain Public Library. I'm sure you can put in the chat the information about the concert and any more specs that you would want our listeners to know, Brett.
And I just wanted to make sure that I just extend our thanks so much to Connecticut Humanities for funding this program. It was, yeah, we couldn't have done it without them. So thank you so much. And that's really all I have. Thank you all for coming tonight. This has been fantastic.
Thank you all.